The grocery bag was on the sidewalk where it had fallen, and the oranges had rolled as far as the curb, and the woman was sitting on the concrete step of her front porch with her back against the door, and her eyes open, and her hands in her lap, in the loose way of hands that have stopped trying. She was not unconscious. She was past the point where calling for help felt like a real option, and had not yet reached the point where anything felt like a real option, and the space between those two things is where people disappear, and she had been in that space for 3 days. A car slowed on Birchwood Lane. It did not stop. A second car passed, without slowing. The January afternoon was going gray at its edges, and the temperature had already dropped 4 degrees since noon and was dropping still, and the oranges on the sidewalk were the brightest color in the entire street. The dog saw them from the truck window. Not the oranges. Her. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with us until the very end, because what that Marine discovered about how this woman had come to be sitting alone on that step without food for 3 days will break your heart before it restores it. We read every comment you leave. Gunnery Sergeant Jackson Cole, United States Marine Corps, retired, had been driving home from the hardware store in Callaway, Montana, when Titan leaned across the center console and pressed his nose to the passenger window and went completely still. Not alert. Still, the full-body stillness that Jackson had spent 4 years learning to read the way other men read weather, and that he had learned to trust the way other men trust instruments. He looked where the dog was looking. He saw a woman on a porch step with her hands open in her lap and her face turned slightly down, and he saw a grocery bag on the sidewalk, with oranges scattered to the curb, and he understood in the particular economy of trained observation that the scene in front of him was wrong in a way that could not wait. He pulled over, without deliberating. He was out of the truck before the engine stopped. Jackson Cole was 43 years old, and carried his size with the unself-conscious solidity of a man who had stopped noticing he was large sometime in his late 20s, and had simply been that way ever since. He was 6'2", broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark hair cut close and a jaw that needed a razor every morning, whether or not he used one. His eyes were a deep, pale gray-green, the color of the Montana sky in October, the color of something that has been outside in all weather for a long time. They were the kind of eyes that looked at a person and did not look away, not from rudeness, but from attention, the specific full attention of a man who had learned in Helmand Province and Ramadi and a classified rotation in Syria that the cost of not paying attention was a number he had learned to keep exact, and that he did not permit himself to forget. He was not a large personality. He was a large presence, which is different. The room did not fill with him so much as it rearranged around him quietly, and by the time anyone noticed, he had already assessed everything in it. He had done 4 deployments across 16 years of service, 2 with the 3rd Marine Division in Helmand, 1 in Ramadi during the Second Battle, and a 4th that had taken him to Syria and to places he was not permitted to name, and that he thought about in the particular way you think about things you have agreed to carry in silence. He had come home from the last with a Silver Star, in a case he kept in the glove box and did not mention, a medical retirement for the torn labrum and the accumulated joint damage that 16 years of operating with full kit had deposited in his body like rent, and a German shepherd named Titan, who had been beside him for the last 18 months of the 4th deployment, and who he had spent 11 months fighting the military working dog adoption program to bring home. He had moved to Callaway because his grandfather had left him 14 acres outside of town that he had never intended to do anything with, and then had not been able to sell, and which had become, in the absence of other clear options, a reason to point the truck somewhere. He had been there 7 months. He was still sleeping in the same 2 rooms he'd moved into on the first day and had not unpacked the 3rd box from the left in the corner of the 2nd bedroom, which was the box with the things he was not yet sure what to do with. Titan was a 7-year-old German Shepherd, 84 pounds, with a coat that ran jet black down his back and flanks and faded to deep rust brown at his chest and muzzle and lower legs, with eyes the color of old amber that had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by any particular part of it. His right ear had lost a quarter of its tip to a wire-triggered device in Syria in 2021 that had been close enough to matter in 3 separate ways, and had left Titan with the clipped ear and a slight forward tilt to his hearing that made him look, in the right light, like a dog who was perpetually listening for something just out of range. He moved with the total physical economy of a working animal. No wasted motion, no performance, simply body in service of purpose. And he had a way of going so perfectly still in the presence of something that required his attention that he sometimes seemed to stop being a physical object and become a measuring instrument. He had never, in 4 years of working with Jackson and 18 months of civilian life, reacted to something that deserved to be ignored. The woman on the step was 74 years old, and her name was Margaret. Tilson and she had been sitting there for 40 minutes because she had gone out to pick up the grocery bag her neighbor had left on the step, and her knees had buckled on the way back up, and she had sat down, and the sitting down had become something that was difficult to reverse. The bag had fallen. The oranges had gone. She had not eaten since Thursday morning, which was 3 days ago, because the refrigerator had stopped working on Wednesday night, and by the time she understood what had happened, she did not have the strength to walk to the store and did not have anyone to call. She had a daughter in Missoula who worked 2 jobs and who she did not want to worry. She had a neighbor named Ruth who had left the bag and who had not been home when Margaret knocked on Thursday afternoon, and whom Margaret had not been able to reach since. She had a phone in her coat pocket that she had looked at twice in the last 40 minutes and had put back both times, because calling 911 for sitting down on your own porch step seemed like an overreaction, and because the particular fear of a woman of her generation and her circumstances was not the fear of being in trouble. It was the fear of becoming a burden, which was a different and in some ways more consuming thing. She had survived a great deal that should have been harder to survive than this. She had buried a husband. She had raised 2 children on a postal worker's salary in Callaway, when Callaway was smaller and harder than it was now. She had kept a house on Birchwood Lane for 38 years, with the specific pride of a woman who has made something out of not very much, and who understands that the something is worth maintaining. She had a vegetable garden in the back that produced more than she could eat from May through September, and from which she had been bringing bags to Ruth's porch since 2011. Her Christmas wreath was still on the door behind her. It was January. She had not taken it down yet because she had been tired in a way that had been accumulating since October, and that she had not told anyone about. She looked up when she heard the truck door. Jackson crossed the lawn in 4 strides. He crouched in front of her, without standing over her, which was the instinct of a man who understood that a person at ground level did not need anyone blocking the sky. He asked her name. She told him. He asked if she was hurt. She said she didn't think so. He asked, without inflection, when she had last eaten. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said Thursday. Titan was at her left side. He had moved there without being directed, not to the left of Jackson, where he typically positioned, but around him, to the left of Margaret, close enough that his warmth was against her arm. And he had sat down there and was simply present in the way he was present when something needed watching over, rather than when something needed stopping. His amber eyes were forward and calm. "Okay," Jackson said. "I'm going to help you inside. And then I'm going to find you something to eat. Is that all right?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment with the measuring quality of a woman who has learned that the world contains people who mean what they say and people who perform meaning it, and who needs to know which this is. She looked at the dog against her arm. She said that would be all right. The refrigerator had been out since Wednesday. The interior smelled of what it had been holding, and it stopped holding. And Jackson assessed it in one look, and closed it, and went to the cabinet above the stove where Margaret directed him, where there was a can of chicken broth, and a partial box of crackers, and a jar of peanut butter that was 3/4 full. He made broth on the stove and put crackers and peanut butter on a plate and set it at the kitchen table and helped Margaret to the chair. And Titan lay under the table with his chin on his paws and his eyes on Margaret with the patient, comprehensive attention of a dog who had made a decision about this person and was not revising it. While the broth heated, Jackson made 3 calls. The first was to a man named Ray Ostrowski, a general contractor in Callaway who had been 2 years ahead of Jackson at Callaway High School, and who picked up on the second ring and said he could be there in 40 minutes with a spare refrigerator unit from his shop that he'd been meaning to install somewhere and hadn't. The second was to his contact at the county senior services office, a woman named Beverly Cho, who had worked that desk for 19 years, and who confirmed that Margaret was not enrolled in any meal delivery or wellness check program, and who said she would have someone on Birchwood Lane by 9 the next morning to begin an intake. The third was a text to Margaret's daughter in Missoula. Margaret had given him the number after some persuasion, and the text said only that her mother was well and being looked after, and that she might want to call in the next day or two from someone who'd stopped by. He did not know yet what Beverly Cho would find when she completed Margaret's intake the following morning. He did not know that the fatigue accumulating since October had a cause that Margaret had received a name for in September, and had told no one, not her daughter, not Ruth, not the doctor who had given her the referral that she had not followed up on, because following up meant making it real. He did not know that the wellness check Beverly ordered would become a coordinated care plan inside 6 weeks involving 2 county programs and a visiting nurse named Carol who would come on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and who Margaret would eventually teach to make her grandmother's biscuit recipe. He did not know any of this yet. He knew only that a woman had been sitting alone on a step for 40 minutes in January with oranges on the sidewalk, and that the not knowing had its own kind of weight that could be addressed one item at a time, beginning with broth and crackers and continuing for as long as necessary. Margaret ate with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has been without food long enough that eating requires some thought, and Jackson sat across from her and did not speak much, and Titan lay under the table between them and was warm against Margaret's feet. Parker Voss arrived at 4:15. His car was a late-model BMW, and he parked it at an angle to the curb that suggested someone who was accustomed to not being asked to park correctly. He was 41 years old, heavyset, with the florid coloring of a man who spent time indoors doing something that required him to convince people of things, and he was Margaret Tilson's landlord. She rented the house on Birchwood Lane, had rented it for 11 years, had never missed a payment, and had a lease that had been month to month for the last 3 years, because the original long-term lease had expired and Voss had declined to renew it on terms she could sign, which was a situation that put her perpetually in the position of being 3 weeks from displacement, and which she had been managing, quietly and alone, for 36 months. He had come because someone, he didn't say who, but his eyes went briefly to the open curtain, and the neighbor's house across the street had apparently called him to mention there was a stranger's truck in Margaret's driveway. He knocked and was let in by Jackson, which was not what he had expected, and he looked at the kitchen scene: elderly woman at the table, man standing, large German shepherd under the table, with his eyes on Voss, with the specific recalibration of a man who had arrived to assert something and was adjusting the assertion in real time. He told Margaret that he had been meaning to reach out. He told her that he'd had a conversation with a development firm and that the property was going to need to be assessed in the spring. He told her this the way he had told it before, which was without specific dates and without a direct statement of what it meant. Because ambiguity had always been sufficient to produce the anxiety he needed it to produce. He told her these things while Jackson stood by the counter with a cup of coffee and listened and said nothing. Titan rose from under the table. He did not growl. He moved to the space between Parker Voss and Margaret's chair and sat down there with the comprehensive stillness of a dog who has heard enough and placed himself accordingly, and his amber eyes fixed on Voss with the particular quality of attention that has no social component, no performance, no warning, simply measurement. Voss looked at the dog. Voss looked at Jackson. "He friendly?" Voss said. "Depends," Jackson said. He introduced himself then, by name and rank and service record, in the same level tone he would have used to brief a situation report, not performing it, simply stating it, the way you state things that are true. He said he understood the property was month to month and asked Voss to confirm the current lease terms and the notice period to which Margaret was entitled under Montana Code Annotated Title 70, which he cited by number because he had looked it up while the broth was heating. He asked Voss whether the development assessment he had referenced had been formally initiated and whether Margaret had received written notice under the required timeline. Voss said the details were still being worked out. "Then there's nothing to discuss today," Jackson said. "When there's something in writing that requires Mrs. Tilson's response, she'll respond to it." With counsel, he paused one beat. "I'd also recommend having someone look at the refrigerator unit before you leave. It failed 3 days ago. Appliance maintenance is the landlord's responsibility under the lease." Voss looked at Jackson for a long time. He looked at Titan, who had not moved. He looked at Margaret, who was looking at her coffee cup with the careful, composed expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for someone to say what had just been said. Voss said he would have someone look at the refrigerator. He left at 4:29. Ray Ostrowski arrived at 4:51 with a refrigerator unit in the back of his truck and 2 sandwiches from the gas station on Route 9 that he said were better than they sounded, which was not a high bar, but proved accurate. Ray stayed 2 hours and installed the unit and drank coffee and talked to Margaret about her vegetable garden and her grandmother's biscuit recipe and did not charge her for any of it, which he would have been embarrassed to have mentioned. Before he left, he gave Margaret his cell number on a piece of paper and told her the unit had a 2-year warranty and that if anything went wrong with anything else in the house she should call before she called the landlord, which was advice Jackson seconded without elaboration. Beverly Cho's intake the following morning identified the diagnosis Margaret had been carrying since September. The referral she had not followed up on was followed up on within the week. The care plan took 6 weeks to build and involved more people than Margaret had let herself need in a long time, which was the adjustment that required the most from her, and which she made with the particular grace of a woman who has spent a lifetime giving and is learning, late, to receive. Carol, the visiting nurse, came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Ruth came back from her sister's in Billings in the 3rd week of January and came over every morning to check the step before she checked her mail, and neither of them mentioned this arrangement or needed to. Parker Voss's development assessment was formally initiated in March. Margaret retained a housing attorney through the county's legal aid program, and the assessment and its implications were navigated on terms that did not require her to leave the house on Birchwood Lane. She had not missed a payment in 11 years. She would not miss one now. 7 months after a January afternoon on Birchwood Lane, Jackson Cole sat on the back porch of his grandfather's 14 acres outside Callaway in the long August evening with a cup of coffee going, warm in his hand and the property spread out in front of him in the particular gold of late summer that makes Montana look like something that was painted rather than grown. The third box in the corner of the second bedroom had been unpacked in April. The silver star was on the fireplace mantel, not because he had decided to display it, but because he had taken it out to look at it one evening and had not put it back, which amounted to the same decision arrived at differently. Titan was in the yard below the porch doing something elaborate with a stick that appeared to be a project of considerable personal importance, and his tail was moving with the unhurried satisfaction of a dog who has found exactly the life his qualities were suited to. Margaret came for dinner on the second Sunday of each month. She brought biscuits made from her grandmother's recipe, which Jackson had been told was not a thing she shared with most people, and which he understood to mean something that he did not have adequate language for and did not need to. She had started the garden earlier this year than last, and it had produced more than she could eat since May, and some of it had been arriving on Jackson's porch in paper bags on Tuesday mornings when he opened the front door. He had stopped asking himself if he was staying. Sometimes miracles don't descend in light from the sky. Sometimes they stop a truck on a county road because a German shepherd presses his nose to a window and goes still, and the man driving has learned across 4 deployments and 16 years of service that the cost of not stopping is a number he will not permit himself to forget. God does not place the right eyes at the right window by accident. He places them by design, and the design is patient and specific, and does not require our understanding, only our willingness to pull over. There are people sitting on steps right now who have not eaten. There are people carrying diagnoses alone because telling someone makes it real and they are afraid of what real costs. There are people managing impossible things in silence because a lifetime of self-sufficiency has made asking for help feel like failure. And it is not failure. It is the thing that was always supposed to happen, waiting for the right person to arrive. Sometimes that person has a silver star in the glove box. Sometimes they have a German shepherd who decides, without being asked, that a woman on a step is worth sitting beside. Loyalty isn't a contract. It is a decision, made fresh. In the moment requires it. If Margaret's story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being found is not the same as being weak, that the person who stops is a gift, and the person who accepts the stop is brave. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you have ever sat on a step like that one, or if you have ever been the person who stopped. We would like to hear your story. It may be the thing that gives someone else permission to call. If you believe in stories of service, loyalty, and the stubborn grace of ordinary courage, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you that the people around you who are quiet and capable and fine are sometimes none of those things, and that noticing is the first act of love.